Delighted now to welcome Tom Hunt from the University of Derby, and Tom is the lead of the Maths Anxiety Research Group, and is going to talk about his study, which has been conducted over several years and across 7 different countries. So it's quite a unique study, looking at mathematics anxiety and secondary school students, and in terms of what predicts their maths anxiety. So welcome, Tom.
Thank you.
Did you use any of this? Did it work?
No.
No.
That was used as well.
Thank you.
Thank you for that, Maria. Yeah, as Maria said, this is a study that I'm going to present, which has taken place over several years. We actually started this before the pandemic, and because of the pandemic, naturally, it made it very challenging to collect data across schools, especially when we were trying to coordinate a multinational study. So I'm really pleased to be able to kind of get to this point, really, where we've actually got some data. This is the first time that we've analysed the data. So it could change slightly, but I don't think what I'm going to present is going to change too much. But very quickly, I mean, why maths anxiety? We all know why maths anxiety, don't we? It's highly prevalent. Lots of people experience maths anxiety. Even those who are, high achievers when it comes to mathematics, people of different ages, all sorts of different backgrounds, countries, gender, you name it. It appears all over the place. It also impacts people's choices in terms of what they want to go on to study and what careers they decide to embark on. And it's also related to broader attitudes around maths as well, self-beliefs, and also, as we've already spoken about, resilience when it comes to maths learning. We also know it impacts maths attainment more generally. Now, the correlation there with maths attainment isn't quite as strong as people sometimes think, but it is there, and it is fairly consistent. But we also know that maths attainment is actually lower in countries in the global south when we look at big data from large surveys such as the PISA survey. So if we know that certain things like maths anxiety predicts attainment, it then becomes really important to then understand maths anxiety and other related factors that bit more, especially when we want to look at things like the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals as well, and to ensure that there's that equity and an increase in opportunity and an increase in quality education across the world. So if we're sort of bearing in mind that kind of global perspective, this is a figure from the PISA 2022 survey. And it really just depicts that overall relationship between maths anxiety and maths attainment. You can see that the R-squared value is 0.25. It's not huge, but it is there. And what this also shows is that there are plenty of countries actually that sort of achieve, pretty highly. Singapore, for example, up there, but they're not necessarily very low in maths anxiety. They're sort of, in the middle somewhere. You've also got other countries who, Turkey, for example, score, pretty highly actually on average in terms of maths anxiety, but score kind of somewhere in the middle in terms of overall maths attainment. So we've got a real range of scores there in terms of anxiety and attainment. But when we kind of look at this as a whole, we get this overall kind of negative relationship. And there's all sorts of variables of interest, but what we've chosen to focus on, partly from a pragmatic point of view, because we didn't want an enormous survey going into schools, we didn't want to put people off. We focused on academic motivation, so general academic motivation, not even maths specific. This is why do you go to school? Is it because you enjoy it? Is it because you want to do well to get a better job? Those kinds of things. But we also looked at maths specific variables too. Largely focused on enjoyment and perceived value, because these are things that we know from other research are really important when it comes to how anxious someone feels. And in line with the idea of resilience, we looked at the importance of struggle, so the perceived importance of struggle. We looked at growth mindset, and in accordance with the PISA survey, we also looked at the influence of peers and parents as well. So it was just 3 items related to those. And again, because we were looking at things from a global perspective, we thought it'd be really interesting and important to look at this idea of individualism and collectivism too, because of those potential cultural differences. And importantly here, what we looked at was the role of shame as well. So we had some specific items that measured shame, partly because this is an under-researched area, but also because kind of anecdotally, a lot of what we hear about is shame, the importance of shame in the classroom, how people feel, how embarrassed they might feel. And actually, we thought it was important to include that, especially when we're looking at this, as I say, from a global perspective. So we generally wanted to know what were the relationships between those variables. We had several more specific hypotheses, but we were just generally interested in those relationships, and also what best predicts maths anxiety. So if we take into account all of those variables, which one best predicts maths anxiety? And how does that vary between those countries? There was a cross-sectional survey, 15 to 16-year-olds, so you're kind of in line roughly with the PISA survey. It's quite a big sample overall, so we had over 1,800 students with a final sample size of just under 1,600. And as you can see, these are the countries that took part. A little bit of variation in sample size. I think Japan, Romania, Turkey, these are countries that already take part in the PISA survey. So it's quite good, really, that we've got these other countries that are involved, and particularly countries that we might consider to be either in the global south or particular continents that aren't really represented, in mainstream research, and particularly within the PISA survey. So very quickly, in terms of the actual measures, just to give you a bit of a flavour of what the actual items were, we used a modified achievement emotions questionnaire. So these were items such as, when thinking about maths class, I get nervous, I enjoy maths class, I'm embarrassed about my lack of knowledge in maths. So they measure anxiety, enjoyment and shame respectively. And then in terms of growth mindset, perceived importance of struggle and perceived value, we've got items such as people are either good at maths or they aren't. Making mistakes is necessary to get good at maths, and maths is essential for my future. And then in terms of intrinsic and extrinsic motivation, so bearing in mind, again, this is a sort of general academic motivation. When in the classroom, I go to school because I experience pleasure and satisfaction while learning new things, or in order to obtain a more prestigious job later on. And then to give you an idea of the peer and parental influence items, most of my friends work hard at maths, so that's a sort of peer influence. All my parents believe it's important for me to study maths. And then an example item from the individualism collectivism subscale of the cultural values scale, success of the class is more important than individual success. Lots of correlations here. I'm not going to have the time to go through every single one, but what this shows, the more bold items, if you like, the ones that stand out, are the stronger correlations. And you can just have a quick glance at that and sort of get a feel for what overall is correlated with what. You can see straight away, just in the top corner there, maths anxiety correlates pretty well with enjoyment and shame. But actually, it doesn't correlate as well as you might think with many of the other variables, especially once enjoyment and shame are included. So straight away, that sort of tells us a few interesting things, and I might come back to this if we have time. And when we put this into a linear regression model using stepwise regression, this is what came out as being the remaining significant predictors of maths anxiety. Because of the sample size, some of these remain significant, but actually were still relatively weak predictors. The things, as you can see, that really stand out, maths enjoyment, but maths shame as well. So enjoyment and shame are the things that are kind of jumping out really from this. We then looked at individual countries and made this comparison. How do those relationships differ in predicting maths anxiety? And you can see across every single country, maths enjoyment and maths shame are significant predictors of maths anxiety. So that stands out to me as being quite important. In whichever country we look at here, despite differences in culture, socioeconomic status, etc., we see that consistent relationship. Gender is another one that kind of stands out a little bit. The school in Iran happened to be an all-girls school, so we couldn't make that comparison there. But again, we saw that sort of general trend where girls were reporting higher anxiety than boys. And with many of the others, you can see it's kind of scattered about. So there's nothing really that sort of stands out as being consistent. So again, the take-home message for me: gender, important, as we've already seen. Enjoyment and shame. These are the things that we might want to start focusing on if we want to tackle maths anxiety. Now, there are, of course, several limitations with this approach. We focused on shame, but there's lots of other academic emotions that we could focus on here as well. Pride, for example, anger, frustration. And I think understanding the importance of shame here makes me want to investigate those other negative emotions as well. I think we need to take into account some of the measurements, how we actually did this. We went through the whole translation process, but what we found through measurement invariance analysis was that actually it was a little bit unreliable in terms of some of the statistics. So it suggests that different countries were responding to the surveys in slightly different ways, which rendered it kind of not proper really to then make comparisons, just looking at the mean scores between countries. It didn't matter in terms of looking at the correlations, but it just meant that there were difficulties in making simple comparisons, for example, of math anxiety between the countries. So there are some measurement issues to consider. We really need to be looking at, have we got reliable and valid measures within each of these countries? We're focusing on individual differences here as well. These are all psychological individual differences. And this survey doesn't take into account really other people, other than the peer and parental influence questions. The reason I say that is we know, for example, teachers are massively important when it comes to maths anxiety. There was a study that came out a couple of years ago using big data, and it was a little bit surprising in how it showed how much of an influence teachers have on pupils' maths anxiety. So teachers' own confidence in maths, also the pupils' perception of the confidence of the teacher as well. These were things that really stood out. And that happened after we designed this study. So if I was to do this again, I would make sure there were questions on the teacher in there. There are obvious difficulties with inferring causality because it's a cross-sectional survey. So we can't necessarily say that shame is the thing that predicts maths anxiety more than maths anxiety predicting shame. So is there some sort of direction there where one causes the other, or is it a kind of bi-directional thing? And I think we need to perhaps look at the complexity of this. It's unlikely to be just a simple this predicts that. There's probably likely pathways. And I think if we go back to this in particular, we can see, for example, that enjoyment actually is correlated with quite a few things. Enjoyment, for example, correlates with peer influence. So how you perceive your peers in relation to maths seems to predict how much you enjoy maths. But we know enjoyment predicts maths anxiety. So maybe we need to focus on the role of peers to predict their enjoyment, which in turn might impact anxiety. And that's just one example. So I think we need to perhaps look at some of those more kind of indirect paths. And I think just to finish, we also need to know a little bit more about shame. What is it about shame that's important here? The items all refer to feeling embarrassed, feeling ashamed, your knowledge, your performance. What can we do there in terms of interventions? To really drill down into, well, why do you feel that way? Why do you feel ashamed? What's that based on? So I think from a cognitive point of view, there's a lot of scope there to explore that further. And I just want to thank all of the collaborators. It was a big effort. This was across lots of countries. So yeah, I just wanted to acknowledge the role of everyone in this. So thank you for listening, and more than happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Tom. That was really interesting, and a huge scale survey, and there's scope even to roll that out, I think, further going forward with the amendments you suggested. So we'll take some questions for the last few minutes. Sean?
Thomas, do you intend to expand the data for the Latin American countries?
Yeah. The plan was to include Brazil, actually. I've got a colleague who's Brazilian. We had schools set up, and because the pandemic hit, it really knocked the study back. And a couple of other countries dropped out. We did what we could, but by the end of the pandemic, we'd kind of lost touch with some people. And luckily we had other countries kind of come on board. But yeah, absolutely, we need greater representation from the certain continents, definitely. But I think, yeah, as Maria said, next steps. Let's look at actually other academic emotions. I think we really need to include that. Let's include more countries, greater diversity, Brazil, absolutely. Yes.
So we can call how it persists.
Yeah.
I have a question. For peer pressure, I think it was detected only in Turkey, among Turkish samples. What is the explanation of this situation? It's interesting because anyway.
Yeah, it is. I mean, it's partly speculative, isn't it? I mean, I should say some of it could be that it's still a very small correlation, so we need to look at that. It's still significant though, so it suggests there's something there. But yeah, in terms of what that means, I guess, I mean, you might be in a better position in terms of understanding culturally why that might be the case, in terms of what goes on in the classroom, for example. But it kind of suggests that, some people might feel more pressured as a result of how others are doing, or at least their perception of how their peers are doing as well. And the questions, relate to, I think, how much peers enjoy maths, how much effort they put in, and those kinds of things. So it's that general sort of, pressure that might come from how well you think other people are doing and how much effort they're putting in. So yeah, maybe there's something about Turkey and Turkish education culture that might explain that.
I will ask Mehmet.
On that table, I think there was no parental influence was predicted like any country.
Yeah.
I was surprised because there is some literature on like type of parenting, way that parents.
Yeah. I think I'd have to go back to the original correlations just to remind myself whether there were any bivariate correlations. But I think if there were, they were very